once you've finalized your image and you're ready to transfer it to a screen, there's a couple options out there. The easiest way to put an image on a screen actually involves using something called screen filler or drawing fluid, or even actually sticky paper. Essentially, any area you cover on the screen, ink can't go through. The areas you leave open, of course, it's going to. So you could cut out a big circle out of contact paper, stick it on there, and you could start printing circles. Since we have a little bit more advanced image that I do not want to hand replicate on the screen, what we've done is we've gone ahead and printed it out onto clear plastic using a very, very thick ink that's not going to allow light to pass through. So what we do is we take this transparency, we're going to coat our screen with a light sensitive emulsion, which means in the dark, the emulsion is still soft and can wash out of the screen, but once it's exposed to UV light, it's going to harden, essentially like a glue, clogging that screen. So what we do is we take our image, we put it into a light box, which is going to have a light source that's going to give us those UV rays. We're going to put it in the box under our screen that's been pre-coated. We're going to close the box and turn on the light. What that does is it blasts our screen with that UV light, which is going to harden all of that filler, but wherever our image is on that transparency is blocking the light and the emulsion is going to remain soft. So once you're done blasting your screen with light, setting that hardener, you're going to rinse out the screen fairly quickly, and all of those areas that have been covered by our ink are now going to wash out, and it's going to leave you with a screen that's ready to print. So before we start throwing things willy-nilly onto our platen and printing, we want to make some markings on our platen so that if I'm printing multiple sheets of paper at this size, I can easily and quickly lay them in and know that they're going to be in the right place so that my run has consistency. So this is called registration, and it involves making some marks or using tape to line out where you want to put your material so that it's going to line up with our print. You can see here on our platen we've got lots of things going on because we print a variety of objects with this rig. So we've got lines for where we want our t-shirts to line up. These long vertical marks are for printing our blank veneers for pressing skate decks. And I've gone ahead just now and lined up exactly where I want my paper print, and I've gone ahead and marked the edges. So every time I drop a piece of paper here, I'm going to get a nice clean and consistent print. The way I did this was by using the actual screen, as it's not covered in ink yet, I can actually look through it and just visually identify exactly where the borders are and make sure that our print is square and centered in the middle. Once I've done this, I use the tape to mark that area off for repetition, and we're just about ready to start printing. We've gone ahead and done our registration, so we know exactly where we want to lay our items out. Now comes the fun part. It's time to actually print. So we're going to take our water-based ink that has been sealed incredibly tightly, and we're going to use a very high-end piece of cardboard to get that ink out of the container. And we want to go ahead and just smear a fairly generous gob of ink onto our screen. And we're running it all down here at the bottom so that we can do what's called our flood stroke. So you've heard me mention multiple times here, areas that are open on the screen, areas that are closed. What we want to do is called a flood stroke. We're going to pull that ink all the way across the screen so that that ink can fill all of the voids in our screen and be ready to print. We don't want to have to push that ink across the screen, through the screen, and onto the item all at once. So it's important that we always flood stroke before and after our print because we don't want to leave the screen open. It's prone to drying out. So a flood stroke, we're going to take our squeegee, and it doesn't require a lot of pressure. We're literally just going to slide that ink all the way across our image. So our screen is now coated. And if we were to look from the underside of our screen, we'd be able to see that the ink is just sitting in that screen ready to go. If I were to touch it, ink is going to transfer to my hand. So the last step for printing, all we're really doing is giving a little bit of pressure that's going to allow the ink in the screen to transfer onto our paper. It takes a fraction of a second, but I don't know where I'm going with that. All right, so we've flooded our screen. We're going to go ahead and drop it. It's important that our screen is not actually making contact right now. It's hovering just above the piece of paper we want to print. And so I like to pull my squeegee. There's people out there that prefer a push method. It's really up to you, personal preference, whatever gets the results you're looking for. So we're going to hold the squeegee with 2 hands. We're going to push it down to make contact with our platen. We're going to pull it back at about a 45-degree angle so the edge of the squeegee is sitting on the screen. And we're just going to pull it towards us, keeping that downward pressure to transfer our ink to our paper. Once we've gone ahead and printed, again, we never leave our screen open, so we want to go ahead and make sure we do a flood stroke to fill that screen. Once we've reflooded our screen, we can lift it up and take a look at what we've printed. So as we're looking at our first print here, I do notice it's a pretty clean print, but we do have a little bit of blotchiness here at the top, which means I didn't have quite enough pressure as I got to that point. So screen printing is not particularly the hardest thing, but to print things with really fine detail and really big areas of ink, you definitely need to fine-tune the amount of pressure you're pushing on your squeegee sheet and the speed with which you are printing. If you push too much and pull slowly, you'll get what's called blowout. That ink's going to actually expand beyond where it needs to. If you have not enough pressure or are pulling too quick, you'll get a little bit of this washout where you don't get even texture. Overall, for our first print of the day, it's still pretty clean. We're happy with it, and we're going to go ahead and keep running the rest of our paper prints. Make sure we are using a little bit of spray tack on our platen, because if we don't, this paper is going to lift up and be stuck on our screen. It's not always the worst thing, but it's an extra chance of smudging or distorting our image. So the platen's now a little bit sticky. We don't want to use too much because we don't want to glue this piece of paper here forever. Just enough so it doesn't lift when we finish our print. We line it up in our registration marks, making sure it's really flat. Screen printing is very texturally sensitive. If there's bumps and things on our platen, it's going to pick that up in our print. So we're laid out flat, we're stuck down. We've already flood stroked our screen, and we're just going to go ahead and print. Then again, before we lift it up, give it another flood. And we can see we've addressed that little bit of blotchiness at the top here. I gave it a little bit more pressure, and we've got a wonderfully clean print. Now that we've gone ahead and successfully completed our paper run, we're going to go ahead and test print a couple shirts. So we had a good friend of ours bleach tie-dye a small number of shirts for us to test this out with. If it's something we like, we're probably going to go ahead and order a bunch of them. So we're going to go ahead and start like we do with the paper print and lay down a little bit of adhesive so that our garment doesn't move around at all during this process. Then we're going to go ahead and load it. We want this image on the front of our shirt. So we're going to slide this over our platen. It's really important when you're printing shirts, you want a nice flat surface under the shirt. You don't want any wrinkles. You don't want the bottom side of the shirt under there. So we wrap it around our platen to make sure that we've got a really good flat surface to print on. And then for this one on registration, we want to make sure that our shoulders are even and our collar is centered. We don't want an image off to the left. And then we're going to check the registration line I made earlier. The top of our graphic's going to fall right about here, which is about 4 finger widths from the top of our shirt. That's a general rule of thumb we do to make sure our image is centered where we want it. And then again, we want to remove any wrinkles, and we really want to make sure our shirt's nice and centered and straight because we only get one shot at this. Now, unlike paper, fabric is going to absorb a little bit of the ink, so we're going to use a little bit more pressure when we're printing on shirts, but we don't want too much pressure because we don't want to blow out our image. So let's go ahead and try this out and see what we get. So we can notice it looks like we need a little bit more pressure towards the top of our screen. This is why we test print on small batches so I don't accidentally run a full line of shirts that I'm not happy with. So on the next shirt, I'm going to give it a little bit more pressure in the follow through and we should get an even consistent print. Once we're done printing on our shirt, we're going to slide our shirt off of our platen. And again, this ink is still going to wash out if we get it wet, so we want to heat set it, and this is where our little flash heater comes in. We're going to lay our garment down with the ink side obviously facing up, and we're going to roll our heater over it, and we're going to give it about 30 seconds to a minute depending on the height and the temperature. Again, if we leave this in here for too long, we're going to burn our garment, but we want to leave it in long enough to see steam escaping from that ink because, again, the water-based ink is going to release that. It's going to look like smoke. Make sure it doesn't turn into smoke. Pull it off after about 30 seconds to a minute. ahead and try to print the first ever alchemy jigsaw puzzle. And this is a little tricky. I did not pre-register this puzzle, so what I'm doing right now is basing it off of our center line so I know it's centered, and I'm just gonna bend down with the screen and visually spot check that my puzzle is both wide enough and long enough for my print. It looks like it's just barely gonna fit. Let's go ahead and see if it works. A little off center, but I could probably just go in and trim these edges to center it up. So the last thing we're gonna print today is a blank veneer that we're gonna press into a skateboard later on. This is a thin vertical grained piece of maple, so it's gonna be perfect for a bottom ply. I've gone ahead and already marked out some registration lines for me to make sure I keep it in the center. And this is a pre-sanded veneer, so it is ready to roll. As soon as we put the graphic on it, we can clear coat it and then press it up into an alchemy deck. So just like we did with both our paper prints and our shirts, we want to just line this guy up and make sure that we are centered with our image. We're looking good here, and I've gone ahead and dropped some registration tape down here at the bottom for myself to know how far out we want to be. So I'm going to line up the edge of my veneer with the edge of that tape right there. Make sure we're square on both sides. Perfect. And again, on this one, we really have one shot to try to make sure our pressure and our speed are accurate. So we're going to go ahead and do it and hope for the best. And we're going to put a little extra pressure because if you can see, this board has a little bit of warble to it. We're going to want to be pushing it real flat as we print. So let's go ahead. We've gone ahead and flood stroke to make sure there's plenty of ink ready to roll through. We're going to drop our screen. And we'll see what we've got. We've got a 83.7%. That's a solid B. We probably won't press this one because it's got a little bit of defects up here in the corners. So on the next press, I know I need to put a little bit more downward pressure to compensate for those ripples, and we should be able to get a perfectly clean print out of the next one. Now that we've finished up our print run for the day, the last thing we need to do is clean up our supplies. Again, if we were to leave this screen unattended with water-based ink in it, it's going to dry out and completely ruin our screen. So before we go straight into washing it off, we do not like waste. We're going to scrape up as much excess ink as we can and return it to its home so that we can use it on another day. So we're going to come back in here and just try to get all of those globs of ink. We don't want to send them down the drain. We want to save them. Okay, just to double check that we've washed all the ink out, we want to always hold our screen up to the light, and we want to look and make sure that the light comes through all of our open areas. Anywhere that there might still be ink in there is going to be a problem later on, but this guy looks solidly clean. So we're going to let him dry off, and let's take a look at our glow-in-the-dark effects. So before we officially finish this project, which we will do by numbering and signing each of our prints, we want to add our glow-in-the-dark feature. So to do that, I've taken one of my early misprints. You can see we had some screen blowout. We lost a good amount of detail here. And instead of throwing this in the trash, I've used this to create the stencil layer for our glow-in-the-dark features. So we really just want the dome top of the head and the heart illuminated. So using our initial print, I know that I can line this up exactly where I need to on my paper print, and I'm just going to create glow effect again in the top of the dome and the heart. So to do so, we're going to take a Super 77 spray. This is what we use for all of our stencils. It's going to hold things down but not glue it permanently to our print. And we're going to spray just a light dusting, just enough to hold it onto our print. And now we're going to go ahead and line it up. So I want to make sure that all of my lines are matching. I don't want that glow feature to end up anywhere other than the head and our heart, and I want to make sure not to crop our character's hands or face. Now that I've got it lined up, I'm going to gently push that stencil layer down. Again, if we don't use our spray adhesive, our paint's gonna seep under that line and we're not gonna get a clean glow effect. So we've got it lined up and ready to go. For this print, we're using a UV effect, so under any black light, this is going to actually illuminate. I'm gonna make sure it's shooken up. And this is a clear layer, so we're not gonna see it until we get a UV light, so it's a little tricky to get an even coat, but what I'm looking for is a glossy finish. Is gonna let me know that the area I want painted has a good layer of paint on it. So we're gonna go ahead and just slowly build up a couple layers of this UV paint. It's important not to hold and blast our paint. We don't want to create drips and runoff. We want to really slowly dust our paint onto the print so that it builds up nice and clean. And now I'm going to look and try to catch the light and make sure that everything in that area is nice and glossy. It looks like we got pretty good even coverage, so we're going to peel our stencil off. And now we can't really tell that that effect has even been put on there, so we're gonna go plug in a black light, test it, and then we'll number and sign it. So now that we've got our UV layer on, we're gonna test it out. We've got a black light here. We can see that it's catching a little bit of glow, and when we turn off the lights, there she is. The very last thing we're going to do for our print is number and sign it, because we want to know what got printed when, how many were in this initial run. So on this style of paper here, we did a total of 9 prints. This one right here was the first one finished, so this is going to be number 1 of 9. We're going to date it 2020, and then we're going to go ahead and sign it. One of the most fun parts of printmaking is having these limited series. There's people out there that like to collect things, that try to get number 1s of everything, but it creates a fun way to interact with the artwork, and it makes them weirdly collectible and interesting to try to find and track down different ones. So that's going to be a wrap for skate class this week. Thanks for joining in. Hopefully this gave you some ideas. Maybe you start screen printing on your own. As always, consult your local Google, as it is full of plenty of resources to get you started. Until next time, keep skating.